The biggest protests yet against Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right government and its plans to overhaul the judiciary. Along with the Iran-Saudi deal, he's facing mounting problems at home and abroad. But how serious is Israel's political crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. Huge crowds demonstrated in Israel on Saturday night for the 10th week running, with some estimates saying that as many as 500,000 people turning out against Benjamin Netanyahu's government and its plans to reduce the power of the Supreme Court. The new legislation would give Parliament the power to override court rulings, allow politicians to appoint judges, and prevent judicial review of the basic laws that serve as Israel's de facto constitution. For supporters of Netanyahu and his far-right allies, the policy represents a necessary curb on activist judges. But it's caused dismay and opposition within Israel's political and military establishment, as well as bringing hundreds of thousands onto the streets.
I'm here to demonstrate and to sound my voice against the dictatorship that they are established here in the name of the so-called law, judicial reform. It's not a judicial reform. It's a revolution that's making Israel go to full dictatorship. And I want Israel to stay a democracy for my kids, for my grandson that will be here, because Israel is a democracy country, and it must stay as one.
I'm here to protest against the reform in the law, and to protest against our Prime Minister, that we call him Crime Minister. He is becoming a dictator, and we don't want dictatorship, we want democracy.
If you give the power to only a certain kind of people, then you can expect certain measures against certain population. I mean, if you were a woman in Israel now, you should be very worried that someone's going to throw you back in the bus and take all your rights, same as the gays in the community. I mean, this is exactly the place that Israel doesn't want to be.
We are protesting because if not, it's like compliance, and we will never agree to have democracy abolished in this country. It's really important that we raise awareness all around the world, so not just in Israel, but all over the world. If anyone tries to do what they're trying to do here, people will go out and demonstrate. It's really important.
And the concern extends beyond the protesters on the streets. Days earlier, the country's president attacked the planned curbs on the judiciary as a threat to the country's political fabric.
The entirety of the legislation that's being currently discussed in the committee needs to be taken off the table, and fast. It is erroneous, it is aggressive, and it undermines our democratic foundations. You, all parties of the House, bear the responsibility. The choice is one, either a disaster or a solution.
We'll begin our discussion with our guests in just a moment, but first, Imran Khan reports from Tel Aviv.
The organisers of the protest say there were about 500,000 people in various different places like Haifa, Tel Aviv, West Jerusalem, that were out on the streets. That's out of a population of about 9.5 million. So it's a significant chunk of the people that were out on the streets. That's putting the government under a tremendous amount of stress. Now, the government for weeks has referred to the protesters as anarchists. On Saturday's demonstration in Tel Aviv, I saw people with placards with effectively their resume on the placard saying, "I served in the Israeli army, I've been a teacher for 35 years, and yet they call me an anarchist." However, for all of those types of slogans, for all the political slogans, the vast, overwhelming majority of people were carrying the Israeli flag. This is a nationalistic demonstration. The people are worried that democracy is under threat here. The judicial reform bill will give the Knesset, the parliament, the power to overturn some Supreme Court decisions, and that's what's driving these protests, and they are getting bigger and bigger every week. Now, that's worrying the government, because if the government starts seeing this seep into their base, that's very concerning for them. Because remember, Benjamin Netanyahu and this far-right coalition have a very strong base. There's a silent majority of people that support this government because they think it's an incredibly strong government. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu can still pass this bill. He has a majority in parliament. There's 120 seats. He has 61 of those. So if the coalition holds, he will be able to pass the bill. However, Israeli President Isaac Herzog is looking for a compromise. He's looking to tone down some aspects of the bill, and he's reaching out to people to try and be able to do that. Whether he succeeds or not, that's a matter of internal Israeli politics. But there is more pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu as well. Political satirists suggest that one of the reasons he's spending each weekend abroad, he was in Italy last weekend, there's rumours he might be going to Berlin this weekend, is that that's the only way he can get some respite from the protesters and the anger he faces out in the streets here in Israel. But there's something else as well. The Saudi-Iran resumption of diplomatic ties. The opposition are using that to attack Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying this was a failure of diplomacy on his part, and that this shows that Israel is isolated in the world because of the makeup of this current Israeli government. Whatever the truth of that, it is being used to attack the Prime Minister and his coalition, but the Prime Minister is a tough guy, and he has this majority, like I say, of seats in Parliament. So if he wants to pass this bill, he will try every trick in the book to make sure it will pass. Whether it passes in the form he wants, that's now up for discussion. Imran Khan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Lots to discuss. Let's bring in our guests for today's programme. From Tel Aviv, we're joined by Gideon Levy, author and columnist at Haaretz Newspaper. In Haifa, Sally Abed, podcast host and member of the leadership at Standing Together, the largest Jewish Arab grassroot movement in Israel. And in Jerusalem is Gil Hoffman, executive director of HonestReporting, which combats what it sees as anti-Israel bias in international media. Gil is the former chief political correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. Welcome to you all. Gideon, let's start with you. Well-known Israeli politician Tzipi Livni says that the protests are not just about judicial reform, it's about identity, it's about what Israel is, it's a battle for the soul of the country as a democracy. Is she right? Or is, as we heard from one of the protesters in the setup there, Netanyahu becoming a dictator?
Tzipi Livni is right, and in the same time, Netanyahu is not yet becoming a dictator. But Adrian, let me frame it in the right framework. We are dealing with a very impressive wave of protest, anti-dictatorship, pro-democracy in an apartheid state. Let's remember this before we get into the subject. By the end of the day, it's about democracy to the Jews and only to the Jews. And it is impressive, it is touching, it is powerful. I totally support it and encourage it and even being excited about it. But we should not forget for a moment that all this is happening when apartheid is still here and has no intention to go and is even not mentioned in this protest. Now, back to your question. Yes, it is about the identity of the elites of this country, the identity, the ethnic elites of this country. This society is torn, and under the cover of a legal argument, there is much more under the surface. But in the same time, I wouldn't say that Netanyahu is a dictator or is about to become a dictator, but he is preparing tools which might serve him one day to become one.
Sally, I saw you nodding in agreement there. You may want to comment on what Gideon was saying. Organisers claimed that the latest protests were the biggest in Israeli history. There are clearly many people opposed to the government's judicial reform plans, but are they in the majority in Israeli society? Is there a silent majority who are actually in favour of what the government is planning to do?
I'm not sure I disagree with Gideon. I do think that the current protest, the way that it was led, and the reason why it's so successful and so loud is because its leaders are the ones who are fighting for their privileges in many ways and for their identity and for how they see, they have a very strong ownership over Israel because if we see who these people are, they are, middle class plus veterans, Ashkenazi from the center. They have a very strong sense of ownership over Israel as a Jewish state. So I don't think I disagree with him. I do think that the protests, as they are right now, are becoming wider in coalition. We're seeing more and more protests that are getting really large in the peripheries with a more diverse participation. We are seeing some very, very little participation of Palestinians, citizens of Israel. However, it is becoming more visible. And obviously, I do think that we have seen some kind of shift, at least in some parts of the protests that are talking about the connection between, or the dissonance, let's say, between protecting the democracy, the Israeli democracy, and instead of that, really talking about redefining democracy and what that means, really, which is ending the occupation and redefining the democracy and the Supreme Court in a way that doesn't maintain an apartheid system. So I don't disagree with Gideon. I do think there is a positive shift, not sufficient, but definitely a positive shift.
Gil Hoffman, opposition leader Yair Lapid says the government's focused only on crushing Israeli democracy. Why does the government insist that these reforms are necessary? Perhaps you could explain it to us, to, quote, rein in the unchecked and unbalanced powers of judges. Do judges in Israel have too much power? Are they making decisions that go against the national interest?
Okay, so first of all, my caveat is that I'm not here to defend or justify or take the side of the Israeli government and its policies. I can explain them and put them into context. Throughout the years of the Supreme Court in Israel, there have been very few minorities represented, in part because of the way the judges are chosen. They're chosen by a selection committee in which the judges and their allies in the Bar Association had a majority to choose their own successors. And too many of them were white, secular, left-wing people, mostly men, choosing more white, secular, left-wing people. And one of the aims of the people who support these changes is to make the Supreme Court more diverse, to have the members of Knesset choose them, whether the coalition will be right-wing or left-wing at the time, and have it better reflect the people of Israel, who are among the most diverse people in the entire world. There's no attempt to involve whether this would help Arabs or not help Arabs. That's not an issue that's being discussed, unlike what my counterpart said. And they do believe that it'll strengthen democracy and the rule of law if, instead of having unelected officials that are Supreme Court judges make decisions, that the people will have more of a say. And what the protests have proven is that Israeli democracy is actually very strong. After having 5 elections in 3.5 years that were about personality politics, about Netanyahu, here you have people taking to the streets because they care about the future of Israeli democracy. And we'll see if compromises will be made. There are meetings taking place right now, and hopefully they can rein in the consensus on what can still be changed to satisfy all sides.
Gideon, how much of this has to do with religion? Is Sally right? She noted that this perhaps is a battle between the classes, perhaps, in Israel. To what extent does your background, your economic circumstances, and how religious you are decide where you stand on this issue?
Religion would be the second or the third identification. Before this, it would be your ethnic identification and being part of the elite or being from the lower classes, being Jewish or not Jewish, and only then come religion. Yes, there is a division according to religion, namely between the seculars and the religious people, where while the secular feel, the liberal secular feel that too much is imposed on them in terms of religion. Israel is by far the most religious country in the Western world. So many things that people who come from the outside can't believe that they see it, from not having public transportations on Saturday to the fact that I cannot marry my Swedish girlfriend in Israel because she's not Jewish, things which are unheard in any secular democracy. But this is not the front of the argument right now. As I say, the main thing is now, we didn't mention the hatred to Netanyahu as something which motivates many of the protesters, even though they wouldn't say it. But Netanyahu became the most hated and the most beloved Israeli politician ever, I think. And those who hate him are ready to do anything to get rid of him. That's in the front of the struggle. And then comes the legal question. Those legislations are really dangerous in the eyes of the protesters, and by the end of the day, they are desiring not to lose their dominance. It's about the dominance of the Ashkenazi elite in this country. When the Supreme Court was almost the last outpost in which the Ashkenazi elite did still handle it and dominate it. They are fighting now not to lose the last outpost.
Let's talk a little about Netanyahu and his motives here. Sally, he came back to power while on trial for corruption, formed an alliance with an extreme ultra-nationalist group who were previously on the fringes of politics. Is all of this perhaps a calculated attempt by him to avoid the consequences of his trial? Does he genuinely believe in what he's doing? Is it right? Or is this a political backfire?
I believe it's the latter. To be honest, I don't think Bibi Netanyahu has really wanted, the plans to be exactly the way they are. I don't think that he would have conducted them the way they are right now, and would have avoided this resistance and this opposition, this strong opposition, which is, from the people. We are saying that it's obviously led by the elite, but let's be honest, this is a very, very powerful, loud, historic opposition to an Israeli government, one that we haven't seen before. So I do think that, Benjamin Netanyahu would have avoided that should he had the option. I don't think it has to do with his court as much, with his trial. I do think he would have found other ways. There are many experts that would have found other ways for him to avoid trial. It's definitely a backfire in many ways, and I do think that it's something he's in a little bit of a pickle, I would say. Absolutely.
Gil, would you agree with that? The government pressing ahead with the plan in spite of these protests. Can it survive? Will this ultimately lead to the collapse of the coalition? How long before we'll be writing Netanyahu's political obituaries again, bearing in mind that it was quick to do so the last time?
Yeah, I covered politics for 24 years for the Jerusalem Post, and I wrote Netanyahu's obituary many, many times, and it was proven wrong. Right now, it's really his justice minister that's pushing this forward. These are ideological issues that Yariv Levin, has cared about for a very long time. And Netanyahu perhaps initially empowered him to do it, and perhaps revenge against the legal establishment that was prosecuting him was part of that motivation. But now it's taken a life of its own, and Netanyahu has himself been prevented from dealing with it by the Attorney General. We'll see right now, there's pressure on moderate elements within the Likud party. If you have 4 or 5 members of Knesset inside the Likud who say this has gone too far, then perhaps it wouldn't pass into law. But I still think that there's going to be a compromise, that what's passed so far are only preliminary readings that don't pass it into law. There is still 3 weeks before the Knesset leaves on its Passover recess. And this is crunch time. And that's why the president has gotten into high gear in putting forth his own proposal that presumably would be what would be passed in the Knesset.
Gideon, is Israel's democracy broken? We've had a succession of fragile coalitions propped up by a myriad of smaller, sometimes extreme parties. Does Israel's entire system of democracy, do you think, need an overhaul?
I have to insist that an apartheid state cannot be a democracy. A state that rules over 5 million people, who has no rights whatsoever, no citizenship, nothing, cannot be defined as democracy. How can we call it a democracy at all? I mean, really, this masquerade must come to its end, calling Israel a democracy. As long as the occupation was temporary, you could call it a democracy with a military occupation. But after 55 years, what about the 5 million people who has no rights? We don't count them, we don't see them. They are part and parcel of Israel today, of greater Israel. And I really refuse to have any discussion about the democracy in Israel, like I wouldn't accept a discussion in South Africa about the democratic procedures among the whites. This is really outrageous. Having said this, I still think that Israel, for its Jewish citizens, is a democracy. The risks are there, the cracks are there, but I'm not a partner to these apocalyptic descriptions that Israel is turning into Hungary, Turkey, or God forbid, even Russia. Not yet. We are on this path, but not yet.
Okay. Sally, would you agree with that? How serious is this political crisis for
I would like to
Israel? Yeah, please.
Even as a Palestinian activist here in Israel, not because I disagree with, conceptually, obviously, I obviously agree with Gideon about the fact that we can't call Israel a democracy, but there is definitely democratic practices within, the 67 lines inside of Israel, in many ways limited for non-Jewish citizens, but definitely less limited for Jewish citizens. And I do think it's also less limited to many other marginalized groups. If we talk about LGBTQ rights, if we talk about women, I do think there is it's a little bit dangerous to come and condition the protests right now or condition their legitimacy to talking about the occupation. We are obviously doing we're putting all of our efforts into impacting the messaging and impacting the kind of resistance that we want to see from inside. We do think it's an opportunity to build a new political current that can really reimagine a democracy and can challenge the current democracy and the way the Jewish Israeli public perceives it. I do think it's dangerous to completely dismiss it and talk about the dangers and the threats of the current overhaul on the, limited and very flawed democracy that's within Israel.
Gil, Iran and Saudi Arabia, as we know, signed an agreement to normalize diplomatic ties on Friday. That was a hammer blow for
Adrian, I need to respond to what they were saying before we move on to Iran.
Please do, Gil.
Absolutely. So first of all, you have to bring in Palestinian politics into this. It's the Palestinian Authority that controls those millions of people, has since the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. They haven't had an election since January 2005 because of the weakness of their own democracy. It has nothing to do with Israel. And that's what's caused the Abbas administration to lose power in cities in the West Bank where they're supposed to be doing the policing. And because of that, Israel had no choice but to go in order to arrest wanted terrorists. It had to do with the weakness on the Palestinian side and not on the Israeli side. Israel is a democracy. It's not apartheid. Comparisons to apartheid are offensive to the South African black people who endured it. They wish they could have had blacks on their Supreme Court. We have Arab judges in Israel who convicted an Israeli president and prime minister. it's as far away from apartheid as can be.
Okay, Gil. I know that both Gideon and Sally are shaking their heads, disagreeing with you there. But we're almost out of time, and that's not the issue that we're discussing here. Gil, how serious is this political crisis? Has Israel faced a political crisis of this magnitude before? Is it the biggest threat to Israel since its foundation?
We have had many crises in Israel politically. In the period of the Oslo Accords, in the withdrawal from Gaza, back in the 1950s when Israel received reparations from Germany after the Holocaust, and Israel managed to make it through all of those. And as you point out, there are distractions, and because of the fight being internal, that's led to international issues like the fight against preventing the nuclearization of Iran falling by the wayside. And that is definitely something that puts Israel's security in jeopardy in the future.
Same question to you then Gideon. I mentioned this Iran-Saudi Arabia deal to normalize diplomatic ties, which must have been a hammer blow for the Prime Minister. Some of Israel's staunchest allies don't particularly like its current government at the moment and would prefer to keep it at arm's length. With problems mounting at home and abroad, how serious is this crisis?
It is serious, but as Gil said, it's not the first serious crisis. Gil didn't mention the big crisis after the 73 war, when the feeling was that we are about to collapse. As I said, I don't see it in those dramatic, pomposic colors, but it is a great challenge. It might lead into a terrible legal and social crisis, but it might also solve. It's not irreversible. We shouldn't underestimate what's going on now, but, few weeks of protest are not changing history. There must be some more steps to be followed, and then we will see, is it really a crack in the basic of Israel, or is it one of those crises that seem so terrible when they happen, and then something happens and they are almost forgotten, leaving very, very few signs. So it's too early to judge.
Okay. There, I'm afraid we must end our discussion. We're out of time. Many thanks indeed, Gideon Levy, Sally Abed, and Gil Hoffman. Thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.